Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning sun in a tunnel didn't rise. It simply slipped into the sky like someone trying not to wake the house. The town breathed in silence, its heartbeat hidden behind shutters and fences. In the yellow bungalow on the eastern corner of Aji Street, Amara stirred her sponge cake mixture as if trying to erase something from memory. The whisk moved in circles, smooth, quiet, consistent. That was Amara in a sentence. She was not loud, not even when she was young. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was strength with no need for applause. Even her husband, David, used to say she was a mystery wrapped in warmth. But time, like a leaking tap, had worn down their words. Now their conversations were reduced to questions about salt and slippers. Still she baked. That morning, her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and lemon zest, two things that used to make David laugh and kiss her forehead. He no longer noticed. Lately, he came home smelling of burnt oil and secrets. He kissed her on the cheek, as if checking off a list. He'd say, "You okay?" and walk past her before she could answer. And Amara would smile at his back, the kind of smile that holds no joy, just obligation. On the radio, old songs played like ghosts in the background, but her mind was on the black blouse she found last week in the back seat of David's car. It wasn't hers. It didn't even fit her. When she asked about it, he'd laughed, too quickly, and said it belonged to a customer's sister. Amara hadn't asked again. What was the point of asking when you already knew? The neighbor's house had a different kind of noise, not loud, just full. Ella had moved in 6 months ago with her husband, Kenneth. They looked perfect, the kind of couple you'd imagine in brochures for dream homes. Ella was vibrant, unapologetically so. Her laughter often poured out of their kitchen window like soup too hot to stay in the pot. Kenneth was quieter, stern-eyed, a man who chewed with purpose and walked like he was used to command. Amara had brought them banana bread on their third day in the neighborhood, as was tradition. Ella had hugged her with the kind of warmth that felt like performance. Still, Amara had smiled. She always did. But it wasn't long before she noticed things, small things. David, who never stayed too long outside after work, suddenly took longer routes home. Sometimes he stopped his car near their house before walking into theirs. Other times, he stood talking to Ella at the fence, their shadows leaning toward each other like old friends. Ella wore short dresses and long perfume, the kind that arrived before her and lingered long after she left. At first, Amara brushed it off. People talk. People smile. That's all. But doubt is like smoke. It finds its way through the smallest cracks, and once it's in, it clings to everything. One evening, she found David humming one of the songs Ella had played loudly the day before. When she asked where he heard it, he paused a beat too long. That beat told her everything. She didn't confront him. No raised voice. No dramatic accusations. She just nodded and went back to slicing vegetables, wondering how long he'd been feeding another woman pieces of the man she married. The week that followed was unusually quiet. Too quiet, the kind that sets birds on edge. Amara went about her routines, but her eyes saw more than they let on. She watched David from the corner of her gaze. How he dressed better now, how he shaved more often, how he checked his phone and smiled at messages he never shared. One night, he showered twice. He'd said it was because he'd spilled fuel on his clothes, but his scent was not oil. It was musk and mint, unfamiliar and deliberate. She said nothing. At midnight, while he snored softly beside her, Amara stared at the ceiling fan, counting the slow rotations as if they were the beat of her bleeding heart. That night, she dreamt of a river she couldn't cross. The water was dark, thick with shadows, and David stood on the other side holding a woman's hand, faceless but familiar. In the morning, she woke up before the sun and baked bread for the church committee. She delivered it smiling. Everyone said she looked radiant. Grief, when hidden well, can look like grace. And Amara had mastered that art. Still, she felt it, a pull in her chest, like something inside her was watching, waiting, growing teeth. She didn't want revenge. Not yet. She just wanted to understand why the man, who once chased butterflies with her on their wedding day, now looked at another woman like she held the last light in the world. Amara's suspicion solidified one Thursday afternoon, not in a loud moment, but in the stillness between two. She had just finished packing an order of cupcakes when she noticed David's car wasn't in the driveway. That wasn't strange. He'd left 30 minutes earlier for a customer call, his toolbox slung over his shoulder like always. But something in the air, the offbeat rhythm of the birds outside, told her to look. She walked to the window with the grace of a woman who'd broken and glued herself back together too many times. Across the yard, Ella stood at her own back door, her dress barely reaching her thighs. Her hair was tousled, not by the wind. And then came David, exiting through the side gate of their compound. Not hurried, not ashamed, just casual, as if routine. He handed Ella something. She laughed. He touched her arm. That was it. That was the moment Amara stopped stirring her batter and began stirring something else, something deeper, darker. It wasn't rage. Rage is noisy. What she felt was older, heavier, quieter. A decision made not with fists, but with patience. She sat down, took off her apron, and wrote in her notebook. She didn't plan to leave. She didn't plan to cry. She planned to listen. To wait. Because sometimes the best way to catch a snake isn't to kill it. It's to make it crawl into a place where it has no room to hide. The weather changed without warning the next day. Not a dramatic storm, but a steady gray dullness that soaked into walls and windows. It matched the heaviness sitting on Amara's chest. That morning, she wore a long cream dress, her hair wrapped tightly, as though to hold in thoughts she couldn't afford to release. She swept the front yard with the same care she always had, her movements slow but intentional, each stroke of the broom methodical, as if sweeping away doubt one leaf at a time. From across the fence, Ella's voice floated out like perfume, warm, sweet, unwelcome. She was on the phone with someone, giggling softly. Amara paused, tilted her head slightly, then continued sweeping. She wasn't listening for words anymore. She was listening for what wasn't said, the silence between syllables, the careful choice of laughter. When a woman starts filtering sounds through suspicion, even silence becomes suspicious. David had left for work earlier, mumbling something about a brake failure on a customer's van. He hadn't kissed her goodbye. Not that she needed him to. His absence had long ago started arriving before he physically left the house. Amara remembered when he used to linger by the door, always forgetting something, just so he could come back and kiss her again. Those memories now sat in a corner of her mind, dusty, untouched, and too painful to hold. In the afternoon, Amara decided to return the empty cake tin that Ella had borrowed a few days earlier, a gesture that required neither urgency nor presence, but it gave her reason to approach the house next door. She didn't dress up for the visit, didn't wear perfume or powder. She walked across the lawn like someone on her way to post a letter, casual, unbothered, purposeful. Her heart beat slowly, like it already knew what was waiting for her. As she stepped onto the porch, the air felt different, heavier, like it was holding its breath. She lifted her hand to knock, but something stopped her. A small sound, faint, like stifled laughter. Then another sound followed, muffled voices, too close, too familiar. Amara's eyes instinctively moved to the side window, half covered with a sheer white curtain. Through the curtain she saw them. Not clearly, not completely. But she didn't need clarity. She knew that back, the slight arch of David's spine, the way his hand rested on Ella's lower back. Ella turned toward him, her mouth forming words Amara didn't hear, but her expression said more than words ever could. They weren't arguing. They weren't talking business. They were alone. They were close. And they were comfortable in a way no neighbor should be. Amara didn't knock. She didn't even flinch. She stood still for a second, her grip tightening around the cake tin, her pulse slowing like a hunter in the wild. Then she turned and walked away, her steps light, as if afraid the ground would hear and betray her presence. The tin clinked softly against her thigh with every step, like a bell tolling in the distance. Back in her kitchen, Amara placed the cake tin in the sink and stared at it for a long time. The metal had fingerprints on it, hers, Ella's, perhaps David's. She didn't wash it. She didn't even touch it again. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the sun begin to set behind the neighbor's roof. The world outside moved on. Children playing in the distance, someone's goat breaking free from its tether, a woman calling out for her son to come inside before dusk. But inside Amara, time had stopped. She sat unmoving for what felt like an hour, the ticking of the wall clock becoming a cruel reminder that nothing, absolutely nothing, had changed on the surface, even though something irreversible had shifted inside her. Her heart didn't break, it rearranged itself. She realized then that grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just changes the way a woman pours her tea or folds her bedsheets. David returned home late that evening, humming as he stepped in. He had a plastic bag in hand with something wrapped inside. "I got fried plantains from that woman near the station," he said with the ease of a man who believed his lies still worked. Amara nodded, smiled gently, and responded, "That's nice." Her tone was too smooth, her eyes too calm. David didn't notice. He ate while she wiped the counter clean with short, silent strokes. When he finished, he kissed her on the cheek and went to bed, as though the world hadn't shifted slightly off its axis. She followed later, climbed into bed beside him, and stared at the ceiling, counting each breath she took as if they were coins she didn't want to spend too quickly. That night, sleep didn't come. It stood outside the room like a beggar, watching Amara from a distance but never entering. Her mind was full, not of Ella and David in each other's arms, but of what she would do next. She wasn't the type to throw plates or call family meetings. No, her silence was not surrender, it was strategy. While David snored beside her, she reached for the notebook hidden beneath the mattress. In it, she wrote the time she had walked past Ella's window and what she had seen. Then she flipped back to the earlier pages, small observations that had felt disconnected before. The perfume, the missing blouse, the careful silences. It all fit now. As her pen moved, she realized how strange it was that people underestimated quiet women. They think because you don't shout, you haven't noticed. But Amara noticed everything. She always had. She put the notebook away and lay back down. Her body curled toward David's back, not to seek comfort, but to remind herself that he was still there, breathing, present, and yet already gone in ways that mattered. She didn't plan to confront him. Not yet. She needed time. She needed certainty. And above all, she needed the right moment. Because when she moved, and she would move, it would not be noise that gave her power. It would be the precision of a silence, so sharp it would cut without bleeding. And so she waited, holding her hurt like a blade hidden in cloth. Morning in a tunnel didn't burst open with light. It crept, dragging itself slowly across rooftops, slipping under doors like an unwelcome guest. Amara was already awake when the first pale streaks touched her window pane. She hadn't slept deeply, only drifted in and out of shallow rest, like a leaf skimming the surface of still water. She moved through the kitchen like breath, silent, present, unseen. Her hands went through the motions of brewing tea, boiling yam, setting aside slices of ripe avocado. Nothing about the morning routine had changed, but everything inside her had. When David walked in, yawning and scratching his chest, she greeted him with the same gentle, "Good morning," she had always given. He replied with a grunt, checked his phone, and laughed at something on the screen. Amara's eyes lingered on his face just long enough to notice the way he tilted the phone away, the way his smile came too easily. She knew that look. It was the same one he used to wear when they first started courting, back when their conversations could stretch into the early hours of the morning, and every sentence from her mouth was something he wanted to catch and tuck behind his ear. That version of David no longer lived in this house. This version lived in a space of half-truths and full silences. He bathed quickly, the scent of unfamiliar cologne trailing behind him like a flag he didn't care to hide. She didn't ask questions. She simply watched him go. Every movement he made was a piece of the puzzle. She wasn't hurt anymore. She was preparing. She was recording. That afternoon, the house felt larger than usual, filled with an eerie kind of stillness that stretched into every room like a lazy animal. Amara sat by the sewing machine in the living room, pretending to fix the hem of a wrapper she had no intention of wearing. She wasn't thinking about sewing. Her mind was outside, across the yard, on the other side of the fence. At exactly 1:30, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of the side gate creaking. A gate that was almost never used. Her heartbeat didn't change, not even a little. She stood, walked to the back room, and peeked through a small opening in the curtain. There he was, David. And behind him, like clockwork, came Ella. Both of them careful, both of them moving with the kind of choreography only practiced sin can produce. They entered Ella's house through the back entrance. The door closed. Amara didn't look away. She didn't need to see what happened inside. She already knew. A deep breath slipped out of her lips, not out of pain, but out of understanding. Everything made sense now. His late arrivals, his sudden concern for aftershave, the way Ella had stopped lingering to chat at the fence whenever Amara was around. Guilt had a smell, and both of them were dripping with it. But instead of fury, Amara felt a strange calm, like something long trapped had finally been named. She went back to her sewing machine, not to sew, but to reach for the drawer beside it. Inside lay her little brown notebook, the one with no label and no title. She opened it to a blank page, picked up a pen, and wrote down the time. 1:31 p.m. followed by 3 simple words. They went in. She didn't write more. There was no need. Truth, when complete, doesn't require decoration. The hours that followed moved slowly, like time itself was hesitant to touch what had just unfolded. Amara swept the corridor, watered her lemon tree, and placed a fresh tablecloth on the dining table. These small tasks were her way of keeping control, anchoring herself to the ordinary while the ground beneath her shifted. By 4 o'clock, David returned home through the front gate, keys jingling, a plastic bag in hand. He smiled as he entered, speaking with a softness that sounded borrowed. "I brought suya," he said, placing the warm, oily parcel on the counter. Amara turned, drying her hands on a towel, eyes meeting his with practiced warmth. "That's thoughtful," she said, and she meant it, not because of the meat, but because everything he did now was being written down in her mind, like a play performed by an actor who had forgotten the audience was watching. He didn't mention where he'd been. She didn't ask. The silence between them had become something they both wore comfortably, like old clothes that no longer fit, but were too familiar to throw away. That evening, they ate together at the table. The television hummed in the background, filling the room with harmless chatter. When he laughed at a joke on the screen, Amara joined in softly, though her laughter never reached her eyes. Her eyes were elsewhere, on her plan. And while David chewed meat and commented on the softness of the weather, Amara was deciding whether she'd use the landline or her mobile. One call, made in the right moment, could burn through the web they'd spun and leave only ash. But she wasn't in a hurry. Timing, she had learned, was everything, especially when one wanted to leave a mark that couldn't be cleaned away. It was shortly after dusk, just before the call to prayer from the distant mosque echoed through the town, that Amara made up her mind. She stood by the window, staring into the night, the scent of roasted peppers still hanging in the air. She had waited long enough. Waiting hadn't made her weak, it had sharpened her. Her silence had become a weapon, and now it was time to use it. She walked into the bedroom and pulled open the drawer where she kept old greeting cards and spare keys. Tucked beneath a Mother's Day card was a slip of paper with Kenneth's number, written down months ago from a neighborhood barbecue invitation. She stared at it for a moment. Then, with her hand steady, she dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a gruff voice answered, unfamiliar and unsuspecting. "Hello." She cleared her throat, keeping her tone calm, as if asking about laundry. "Mr. Kenneth," she said, "I think you should come home right now. Don't ask questions. Just come. Quietly." A pause. Confusion. Then, "Who is this?" But she had already ended the call. She stood still for a moment, letting the silence wrap itself around her again. No part of her trembled. No guilt crept in. That single action felt like releasing a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for months. Outside, the street lamps flickered on, and a dog barked somewhere down the road. Inside, Amara sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the doorway. The house was still, but outside, in the neighbor's home, a storm was about to begin. One she had lit with the gentlest spark, and no one would ever guess she had held the match. The sky wore a strange kind of silence that evening, not the usual gentle quiet that fell over a tunnel at dusk, but something deeper, more ominous, like the air had thickened and was holding its breath. Amara sat on the porch with a glass of orange juice she hadn't taken a sip from. The condensation on the glass slid down and pooled at her fingers, but she didn't wipe it away. Her eyes were fixed on the road, waiting. She didn't know exactly how long it would take Kenneth to return, but she trusted a man's instinct when it came to his home, especially when that home was no longer safe. Every car engine in the distance raised her pulse just slightly, but her face remained unreadable. The wind stirred the branches of the mango tree near the fence, and somewhere in the neighbor's compound, a chicken squawked, loud and out of place. Amara's breath stayed steady. Her lips moved around no words, but her mind was full of thoughts, not chaotic or hurried, but deliberate, composed. There was something sacred about that stillness, something unsettling. She had not chosen to become this version of herself, but it had emerged anyway, like a second skin forming around a wound too deep for bandages. Inside her house, the smell of stew hung in the air. She had left it on the stove on low heat, knowing David might come back hungry. It wasn't bitterness that made her prepare it. It was precision. She didn't want him to sense a shift. Not yet. The best traps, she believed, were the ones that looked like safety right up until they snapped shut. The sound of Kenneth's pickup came like thunder rolling through calm waters, abrupt, urgent, heavy. Amara didn't move from her chair. She only leaned slightly forward, as if adjusting her posture to hear better. The truck's tires crushed the gravel with impatient force. The gate clanged open, not pushed gently but thrown wide, its metallic shriek slicing the calm. From her seat, she could just make out his figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the focus of a man who has heard enough to believe. Kenneth didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight into his house, the door slamming behind him like a book being closed mid-sentence. Then, for a few seconds, silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around your throat. And then came the storm. Raised voices. Low at first, then rising like heat from a fire that had been waiting for air. She couldn't make out the exact words, but the rhythm of anger was unmistakable. David's voice surfaced, higher pitched than usual, defensive, desperate. Ella's voice cracked once, then roared back with something sharp and wild. A crash followed, a sound like glass or a plate hitting tile. Amara closed her eyes briefly, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. What she had set in motion was not a game. It was a collapse, a truth too large to keep hidden any longer. Her hand tightened around the glass, the sweat from it dripping between her fingers. Still, she didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about revealing the truth in a way that no one could ever deny. And right now, that truth was screaming its way into the night air, loud enough for every house on the street to wonder, to speculate, to remember. Children had begun to gather outside, their laughter fading into whispers as they noticed the tension coming from the neighbor's compound. Curious eyes peeked from window slats. A few adults came to their porches, pretending to stretch or sip water, but they too were listening. Ecunnell was not a town that thrived on drama, but when it appeared, it spread like spilled palm oil on a polished floor, staining everything impossible to ignore. Still, no one dared go close. Kenneth's reputation preceded him. He was not a man easily stirred, so for his voice to be raised like that, for Ella's sobs to echo through the compound, something had truly ruptured. Amara remained seated, her composure so complete it made her nearly invisible. It wasn't that she wanted people to believe she had nothing to do with it. She simply needed no recognition. What had happened was not for spectacle. It was for clarity. It was for the silence that would come after, the one she had been waiting for. As the shouting peaked and then began to fade, replaced by short, sharp commands and the sound of hurried footsteps, Amara finally stood up. She walked inside her house, placed the untouched glass in the sink, washed her hands slowly, and wiped them dry. The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly. She removed it, poured herself a fresh cup of tea, and sat by the window this time, staring into the backyard. David had not returned yet. That was the next step, the moment of his reckoning, when he would walk in unaware, carrying a lie that was already ash. It wasn't until nearly 10 that David appeared, walking through the front gate with an awkwardness he tried to hide. His shirt was wrinkled, one of the buttons misaligned, and there was something in his eyes, not guilt, but confusion, as though the world had turned slightly, and he hadn't noticed when. Amara met him at the door, her face calm, her hair still wrapped in the same cloth from morning. "You're late," she said softly, not accusing, just stating. He looked at her, searching for something in her tone, something that would tell him what she knew or didn't know. But she gave him nothing. He nodded, said something about a long evening at the shop, and stepped inside. The smell of stew was still warm in the air. He seemed almost relieved. He took his seat at the table, and she served him quietly, placing the bowl before him, refilling his water glass, wiping the edge of his spoon. It was a normal night, exactly the way it used to be, and that terrified him. He kept looking at her, waiting for a crack, a question, a look of accusation. But all he got was silence, the same steady, composed silence she had been giving him for weeks. As he chewed, Amara watched his movements, every bite, every glance. She said nothing about the commotion next door. Nothing about Kenneth's return or Ella's cries. It was not the time. It was not the way. Some truths, she believed, should not be told with words. They should be made to sit beside you, at the same table, and eat with trembling hands. The next morning, the sun returned to Ecunnell with a brightness that felt too honest for what had happened the night before. Light poured into every corner of Amara's home, reaching places that hadn't seen daylight in weeks. But Amara moved through her house without noticing the sun. Her feet were steady on the tiled floor, her breathing soft, her thoughts quiet. In the kitchen, she boiled water and peeled oranges with the same care she gave to everything, each movement thoughtful, each sound deliberate. David was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. She had heard him tossing during the night, adjusting his pillow too many times, shifting as though haunted by dreams too fragile to hold still. He hadn't spoken much after dinner. He'd mumbled something about work the next day, something about exhaustion. Amara had simply nodded. That was all she did now. She nodded, smiled gently, answered questions with questions. It wasn't that she wanted him to suffer in confusion. She simply knew that silence had begun to do something no confrontation ever could. It was unraveling him, thread by thread. The quiet between them was now louder than any slap, more punishing than any insult. And still she cooked. She wiped his shoes clean where they sat near the door. She folded his trousers and ironed the collar of his Sunday shirt. All without a word. She didn't need to scream to leave a mark. She had learned that sometimes love dies not by being broken, but by being ignored into stillness. And in that stillness, something else had begun to grow inside her. Not hatred, not bitterness, but a sense of finality. By the time David came out of the bedroom, the table had already been set. There was yam and pepper sauce, sliced boiled eggs, and fried plantains that smelled too good for someone with a guilty conscience to enjoy fully. He sat slowly, like someone walking into a room where he knew a trap might be hidden. His eyes darted around, resting on Amara's face for just a second too long, searching for signs, anything out of place, a shift in her expression, a curve in her smile. But she was unreadable, just as she had been for weeks. He reached for his fork, cleared his throat, and said, "The food smells good." Amara looked up from her tea and nodded. "Thank you." That was all. There were no questions about where he had been. No mention of the screams next door. No confrontation. The absence of her anger terrified him more than any argument would have. He forced the food into his mouth, chewed too quickly, then slowed down as he noticed her watching. Not staring, just watching. Like someone taking quiet inventory of a man unraveling beneath his own lies. He reached for the water jug and nearly knocked over the salt container. "Sorry," he muttered. She wiped the spill calmly, folded the napkin, and returned to her seat. David exhaled heavily. "So anything happened in the compound yesterday?" he asked, eyes narrowed. Amara tilted her head slightly, then replied, "The wind was strong. A few things fell." She took a sip from her tea. "But nothing out of the ordinary." David swallowed hard, nodded too quickly. He knew. He just didn't know what she knew. And the weight of that not knowing was beginning to dig into his shoulders like invisible hands pulling him down. He left for work earlier than usual, his footsteps uneven as he walked to the car. Amara didn't wave him off. She simply closed the door behind him and leaned her back against it for a moment, letting the silence of the house wrap itself around her again. She was tired, but it was not the kind of tired that sleep could cure. It was a bone-deep weariness, the kind that came from holding yourself together when all you wanted was to fall apart. But she wouldn't fall. Not now. She walked back into the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the stove, and took out the notebook. The cover was starting to fray. She flipped through the pages, each one carrying the weight of observations so subtle they could only come from a woman who had stopped speaking so she could hear better. She reached the last page and wrote a single sentence. "He asked about yesterday, but he already knows." Then she closed the book and returned it to its place. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she didn't need to know yet. She had time. The house felt like a waiting room now, a quiet place between what was and what was coming. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly stirring. Children with school bags shuffled down the road. A bicycle bell rang from somewhere near the shops. And across the fence, Ella's house remained closed, the curtains drawn tight. There was no music playing from her windows, no laughter spilling out into the morning air. Kenneth's truck was gone, but the silence he left behind remained, thick and echoing. Amara poured herself another cup of tea and stood by the window. Not to watch, just to stand, just to exist in the stillness she had earned. That afternoon, she walked to the market. The vendors called out as they always did, some by name, some by nickname, all unaware of the quiet war she was navigating. She bought tomatoes, pepper, and onions, listening carefully to the gossip flitting between stalls like sparrows. No one had a full story, just pieces. Some said Ella had packed her things in the night and left. Others said Kenneth had driven her to her sister's house. One woman whispered that Ella had been caught in something shameful, but didn't say what. Amara listened without reacting, her face the picture of polite indifference. When she returned home, the house welcomed her like a loyal servant, no questions, just quiet. She cooked slowly, tasting each spice with care, her mind focused and clean. By the time David returned, she had set the table again, this time with groundnut soup and fresh pounded yam. He walked in, looked around, and asked, You went to the market? She nodded. Yes. He pulled out the chair and sat, watching her. You're quiet lately, he said, almost as if testing her temperature. Amara smiled, soft and slow. I've just been thinking a lot. He didn't ask what about. He didn't have the courage. He only picked up his spoon and began to eat, his movements too careful. Amara sat across from him, her expression calm, her voice still. And in that quiet dining room, she realized something new. She wasn't waiting anymore. The moment had already passed. What remained now was aftermath. And in that aftermath, David would live. Not as a man loved, but as a man forgiven silently, and forgotten completely. The rain arrived like an afterthought, hours after the sky had already turned to ash. It began as a murmur against the tin rooftops of a tunnel, building slowly into a steady rhythm, washing over the streets and the unspoken things they carried. Amara stood barefoot on the back veranda, letting the cool mist cling to her skin. She wasn't running from the rain. She welcomed it. There was something cleansing in the way it fell, soft, unhurried, unapologetic. The lemon tree in her backyard trembled under the weight of the droplets, its leaves turning downward, as if bowing to some unseen truth. The earth beneath her feet felt cool, damp, forgiving. It reminded her of her childhood, of the days she used to dance in the compound when thunder rolled like a beating drum in the distance. But this rain wasn't for dancing. This one was for quiet reckoning. Behind her, the house was still. No radio playing. No clatter of pots. David had left early that morning, claiming he had a job outside town. He had kissed her forehead before leaving, the way men do when they are trying to convince both you and themselves that everything is fine. She hadn't flinched, hadn't pulled away, but the kiss had landed on skin that no longer recognized him. He left with an overnight bag, one he packed too quickly. Amara had watched him through the curtains as he drove off, his car disappearing into the distance like a word erased from a sentence. She didn't cry. She had already done all her grieving in silence, layer by layer, until there was nothing left to mourn. She walked back inside, her feet leaving faint prints on the floor, water trailing behind her like a secret unwilling to stay hidden. The air smelled of wet earth and citrus soap. In the kitchen, she boiled water, not because she needed tea, but because she liked the sound it made, soft bubbling, like water remembering how to breathe. She set the kettle down and opened her notebook for the last time. The pages were nearly full now, ink bleeding into every corner like truth spreading across a surface that could no longer contain it. She turned to the final page and wrote in clean, measured strokes, "He will never admit it, but I no longer need him to." Then she closed the cover, tied it with the thin string she'd once used to seal spice bags, and tucked it into the bottom drawer beneath old holiday cards and faded receipts. It no longer mattered who found it. It had served its purpose. She sat at the table and looked at her hands, hands that had cooked for love, served in betrayal, and folded sheets that would never again hold shared dreams. She had not spoken to Ella since that night, had not looked toward the neighbor's house again. She had nothing to say to the woman. Her silence had said it all. From what little she gathered at the market, Ella had left town. Kenneth had stayed. A man walking around with wounds that weren't visible, but left trails in his voice when he greeted people. Amara knew what it meant to carry invisible bruises. But she also knew what it meant to heal quietly. Not all scars are for showing. Some are stitched beneath the skin and worn like armor. The days began to lengthen. The air in a tunnel turned warmer, and the scent of mangoes returned to the roadside stalls. Amara moved through time without urgency. She rose with the sun, cooked only for herself, played music when she felt like it, and sometimes let the phone ring without answering. She no longer felt the need to explain her silences to anyone. People noticed her more now, not because she sought attention, but because she carried herself with a quiet certainty that made even the loudest voices take a step back. Some days, David returned from work with tired smiles and pointless stories, as though the hole between them could be filled with talk of traffic and tires. She would listen, nod, and serve his food. But there was no longer space in her for resentment. Only distance. He too had changed. There was a carefulness to the way he spoke, a pause before each sentence, as if measuring whether it would be the one to finally shatter the glass that separated them. But it never was, because Amara didn't wait for that anymore. Her forgiveness had arrived not with fanfare, but with fatigue. And it hadn't come for him, it had come for her. She no longer needed to watch his movements, record his lies, or interpret his silences. What she needed now was peace. And that peace came from letting go of the question she had once clung to, why? She no longer needed the answer. Sometimes, Understanding a person isn't the same as keeping them. And sometimes the greatest clarity arrives not in what someone tells you, but in what they no longer can. On a Thursday afternoon, several months after the call that changed two households, Amara stood in front of her mirror. She wore a coral-colored blouse with a skirt that flowed just past her knees. Her hair was twisted neatly, pinned up with simple clips. She looked at herself with calm eyes, not searching for beauty or age or signs of sadness, but simply acknowledging the woman who had survived herself. She reached for her earrings, the small silver ones her mother had given her, and put them on slowly. There was a knock at the door. She walked over, opened it to find Mama Adewu, her church group leader, standing with a folder. "Amara, we need help organizing the youth seminar," she said. "We thought of you first." Amara smiled and stepped aside to let her in. That evening, as they planned over roasted groundnuts and notebooks, Amara laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was real. Later, after her guest had left, she sat outside and watched the stars blink slowly into place. The breeze lifted the hem of her wrapper and danced around her ankles like a child asking to be noticed. She closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, not to forget the past, but to release it. Behind her, the house remained silent. David was in the living room, asleep in his chair, a newspaper covering his chest like a blanket of unfinished questions. She didn't wake him. She didn't need to. In the quiet that surrounded her, in the life she had carefully stitched back together, there was nothing left to say. And that, truly, was her freedom. Not every wound needs to be shouted about. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence rooted in wisdom. Let your pain teach you, not twist you. You don't always have to fight to win. Sometimes, peace is the loudest victory. Choose dignity over drama. When people show you who they truly are, believe them the first time, and build your peace beyond their reach. May your heart never carry more than it was built to hold. May betrayal never break your spirit, and may peace find you in the places where confusion tried to bury you. May your silence speak louder than vengeance, and your wisdom shine brighter than chaos. May your home be full of truth, your days full of clarity, and your nights full of deep, healing sleep. May you always rise above the noise with grace, with strength, and with the kind of calm that shakes the world without a single word. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.